Mansfield College. And this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sheryll Cashin, who is a professor at Georgetown University, to speak to us about racial healing in the US in the Biden era. Welcome, Sheryll. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. I heard Professor Cashin speaking in April 2018 in the States, and I was hooked. So I'm absolutely delighted that we've got her here to speak at Mansfield. She's not a newbie to Oxford. She was born in Huntsville, Alabama, but has, as I discovered from Wikipedia, and I didn't know before today, a degree from Vanderbilt University in electrical engineering. After that, she came to Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. She was at St. Cat's and had her degree in English law, and then obtained her JD with honors from Harvard Law School. She worked in the Clinton White House. She's been a litigator. She was a clerk indeed, to Justice Thurgood Marshall, upon whose Bible Kamala Harris recently became sworn in as the first woman and first woman of color to be Vice President of the United States. And she is a specialist in civil rights and particularly issues about race in America. Her books include The Failures of Integration, How Race and Class Are Undermining the American Dream, a memoir, The Agitator's Daughter, which is the story of her amazing family and their role in public life, Place, Not Race, A New Vision of Opportunity in America, and Loving Interracial Intimacy in America and the Threat to White Supremacy. She has a new book coming out later this year, I think in about September, White Space, Black Hood, about the impact of residential segregation on racial harmony in America, which she is obviously having to rewrite frantically at proof stage to take account of the change of regime that we have recently had. And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing her talk. While Sheryll's speaking, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function, and I'll get through as many as I can after she's finished speaking, but don't hold back in asking the questions, and I will keep an eye on them as the talk's progressing. So thank you very much for speaking to us, Sheryll, and I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's delightful to be here. My only regret is that I'm not there with you in person in college. I appreciate your audience wherever you are. And I really want to commend Mansfield College and you. I'm very, you didn't mention that you had hosted me and my family 2 summers ago. And we had a delightful weekend there. And I'm just so enamored of this college and its mission and bringing people from diverse backgrounds to Oxford and rising with diversity on the Norrington table, although you guys have not yet surpassed St. Cat's. So, but anyway, let me get started. So what a charge. Helen Mansfield, my dear friend, asked me to talk about US racial healing in the Biden era in 35 minutes. I'm going to begin with a brief history lesson to underscore what I think this moment in American politics means and whether and how racial healing is possible. As a candidate, President Biden called his campaign and this moment a battle for the soul of America. He was motivated to run because of what transpired in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, a rally billed as the Unite the Right rally was organized to unify the white nationalist movement and oppose the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. This is many, more than 150 years after the Civil War, still fighting about symbols of the Civil War. This riot ended in mayhem and death of Heather Heyer, a counter protester. And Biden said this: white supremacists descended on Charlottesville with torches in hand and hate in their hearts. And he decried that a US president, Donald Trump, suggested that there were very fine people among the rioters. And Biden's invocation of America's soul was at the heart of nearly every major speech he gave in his campaign. At bottom, it was a plea for unity of purpose across boundaries of race, ethnicity, creed, and political leaning, a politics that unifies rather than divides, and by definition was multiracial and pluralistic. And his politics, his refreshing politics, which centered racial justice and racial healing, it reminded me a lot of the radical Republicans during Reconstruction. This radical idea that the Reconstructionists put in motion was this idea that Black people, newly freed Black people, should be able to vote, but not just vote, but run for office and be fully actualized citizens who shape public policies and create new institutions that bring all people along. And I'm proud to say, and I write about this in my memoir, The Agitator's Daughter, which Helen mentioned, proud to say my great-grandfather participated in Reconstruction, served in the Alabama legislature, one of 600 Black men who served in the legislatures of the states of the former Confederacy. And Reconstruction itself was powered by interracial alliances among newly emancipated Blacks, although my great-grandfather was never a slave, recently arrived Northern white carpetbaggers and moderate Southerners who had remained loyal to the Union. Together, Black and white people created new constitutions in the former Confederacy, new social contracts that provided for universal equality, universal male suffrage, created free public education for the first time. It was the most robust biracial democracy that the world had ever seen. And immediately, white supremacists sought to destroy Reconstruction, and they did with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877. A Republican-controlled Congress agreed to remove federal troops from the southern states in exchange for Democrats accepting Republican Rutherford Hayes as the winner in a disputed election. And with the removal of federal troops, the Ku Klux Klan and secret societies, domestic terrorists, became the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party. It was the Democratic Party that was committed to white supremacy in the 19th century. Democrats retook control of the South, and white supremacy, this ideology, was the central organizing principle of the party, of Southern politics for nearly a century. And it bears emphasis that whiteness as a concept, which does not exist as a matter of science, was constructed in America to separate dangerous whites who might ally with people of color and demand something of economic elites. I wrote in my book, Loving, about this. In the Virginia, the first and largest of American colonies, I'll say the largest, Virginia, what you could find in the 1600s was indentured white servants, mainly English and Irish people, working in concert with enslaved Blacks and relatively small number of enslaved Indians. And prior to the legal construction of whiteness, whites and Blacks and Indians, the bonded people, they fraternized together, they would get drunk together, have sex, marry, run off, steal hogs together, and rebel together. And the people who could afford to own the best land in that society and who could afford to own a contract tied to a body decided to create Black chattel slavery and give privileges to whites that they formerly didn't have in order to separate and quiet these kinds of rebellions. And, you know, whiteness had a political function then, as it does now in American society, to try to unify whites and blind them into supporting policies and institutions that conferred wealth on elites, whether it's slavery or Jim Crow or mass incarceration in a private prison industrial complex, or, as I'm exposing in my recent work, an intentional system of residential caste that primarily benefits residents of affluent white spaces. Well, after Reconstruction, supremacists used violence and fraud to retake control. And by the turn of the 20th century, Southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, all adopted new constitutions to establish white supremacy by law rather than violence and eliminate Black people from participating in politics. And it took a while, but a new generation of civil rights protesters rose and demanded a different racial order, powered famously by Dr. Martin Luther King's vision of nonviolent militancy and Christian radicalism. And my parents were very much a part of that movement. My mother took me to a sit-in and got herself arrested with me in her arms. I was 4 months old. And, you know, I grew up with that kind of activism. Well, Black Americans returned en masse to Southern politics with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which came about because Black people in the South mounted sustained organized protest. Black people and their allies marched, rallied, boycotted, petitioned, and filed lawsuits. And the Voting Rights Act unshackled American democracy, producing millions of newly registered Black voters across the South and new voters of color nationally, everywhere. President Lyndon Baines Johnson was receptive to the demands of this Black-led multiracial movement for racial equality. He and Congress, and a Congress that included new Black representatives in the 60s, enacted laws to give material equality to all people. But as with the first Reconstruction, there was backlash. And those who feared a new multiracial politics that demanded equality suppressed, gerrymandered, and divided what legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez called dog whistling, political rhetoric designed to divide and conquer. They did this to hold on to power. And for 5 decades, beginning in the 60s, Republicans and Democrats invoked stereotypes to justify largely anti-Black policies like ghetto isolation, like mass incarceration, and to distract voters from plutocratic tax relief that often was paid for with savage cuts to programs essential for struggling people. And among the common dog whistles of American politics, welfare queen, super predator, thug, looter. We saw this kind of language coming out of Donald Trump's mouth in his political campaigns. Republicans in particular worked a realignment through a Southern strategy of white identity politics that stoked division. Okay, I'm gonna confess to you that I just had a little technical problem and I need to, what happened was I was touching my screen and my speech went very big and I just have to fix the view so that I could see it. Pardon me. Something always goes wrong with technology, doesn't it? Okay, I'm almost getting it back. And the thing to do is just to stay calm, right? Give me a second, just a second. Okay, it's back. I apologize. All right. So Republicans in particular worked a realignment through a Southern strategy of white identity politics that stoked racial division. And the South turned solidly red, and cynical division, particularly racial division, became national GOP Republican strategy, culminating in the gross, overt white nationalist appeals of Donald Trump. And the end result of this 5 decades of divisive rhetoric and politics, coupled with partisan gerrymandering, the average Republican in Congress serves a district that looks like America in the early 70s, and the average Democrat serves in a district that looks like America of 2030. These are 2 different worlds, right? The end result of all of this is a basic architecture, a basic racial architecture of American politics. A solid majority of whites votes Republican. That was true in the last election. 58% of white voters voted for Donald Trump. More whites than voted for him in 2016. Meanwhile, large majorities of Blacks, Asians, Latinos, Indigenous people vote Democratic in national elections. And every candidate in the United States who's running for statewide or national office confronts this basic racial architecture and has to decide how to deal with it. Fortunately, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, in the tradition of the first Reconstruction and the second, decided to run and try to build a multiracial coalition by speaking plainly to the hopes and aspirations of all people, invoking our founding egalitarian values. And they won with 81 million votes, the largest popular vote total in American history. And with Kamala Harris, the first Black, South Asian, American, and female president, this suggests real possibilities for a functional multiracial democracy that brings all people along. And, then came January 6th, 2021. A day that will live in American infamy, right? January 6th should have been a day of celebration of American democracy, the day that the Electoral College results, 306 for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, was supposed to be certified and was certified. Should have been a day of celebration of a cherished US tradition of peaceful transfer of presidential power, and a day of celebration of the historic wins for Democrats in the Georgia Senate runoff races. And the morning did feel particularly celebratory for Black Americans like myself, thanks in large part to the intense engagement of Black Americans in organizing and mobilizing in Georgia. Georgia elected for the first time in its history a Black Democratic senator, and in Reverend Raphael Warnock, and its first Jewish senator, John Ossoff. And in doing so, Democrats clinched control of the Senate with a tie-breaking vote from Vice President Kamala Harris. But as we all know, that afternoon, jubilation gave way to shocked sadness when largely white insurrectionists stormed the US Capitol in a failed attempt to disrupt constitutional processes of our democracy. Rioters displayed the Confederate flag and other white supremacist symbols, including a noose, as they trampled. I did it again. Hold on. I apologize. I'm going to fix it real quick. As they, trampled the grounds, the sacred grounds where the people's business is supposed to be done. And what we saw in those sad, violent scenes was a new generation of people who had been fed lies and an ideology of white dominance. And these ideas were so entrenched in their psyches that they could not accept the outcome of a free and fair election. In truth, I think it's fair to say that many of them could not accept the loss of centrality of whiteness in American politics, in American culture, could not accept robust pluralism. So will America ever be able to break this cycle? And what will it take? To begin, we need a rhetoric that centers racial justice and racial reckoning, rather than avoiding it or exploiting racial division for votes. And refreshingly, Joe Biden did this on the campaign trail and in his inaugural address. And I quote him from the inauguration: "A cry for racial justice some 400 years in the making moves us. The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer." And I have to admit, I choked up. I choke up now when he said these words. Which I recognize the phrasing of Langston Hughes, the poet Langston Hughes, and Dr. King. The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer. He acknowledged America's long dance from its founding between self-evident truths of universal human equality and an ideology of white supremacy, which was necessary for conquest of indigenous people and for founding slavery. Without this inaugural address, the first time in American history that a president of the United States says the words white supremacy and says we must confront and defeat that extremism and domestic terrorism, it's clear that the political tradition of lying to people to justify the way things are has clearly been disrupted in Democratic Party politics. And that's no small thing. The Democratic Party for a century was the party of white supremacy in the South. And how did that come about? Well, Joe Biden had to compete, particularly for Black voters, to save his candidacy in the presidential primaries and to win in the general election. And he was forthright about that, in his victory speech, saying, African Americans, you had my back, I'm going to have yours. He also ran against a president, Trump, who stoked racial division rather than bridge it. And he ran against a backdrop over the summer of Black Lives Matter protests and police killings that made names like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor household names. So Joe Biden had an incentive and a platform for speaking plainly about matters of race. It was a perfect storm. Now, so centering racial justice is necessary for racial hearing, but there's also no shortcuts to reckoning with the habits and structures born of white supremacy. You can have all the rhetoric you want, but you actually also have to grapple with the actual structures that white supremacy built. And, there's been an awakening in the last several years. I have to say, as an author who early on in my career would have trouble getting a publisher. I've had publishers say, race books don't sell. Well, race books are flying off the shelves in the United States these days. And there's been an awakening to the fact that it took 7 decades of intentional racist federal policy to create the separate and unequal landscape that we live with and that Donald Trump tried to exploit for political gain in his campaign. You may recall, he cast himself over the summer as the protector for white suburbanites from invasion from Black people and tweeted about and spoke about how he had revoked a regulation that required mixed income housing. Anyway, systemic racism will not be undone with a summer of protest and installing a new president. Intention created these structures, intention is required to dismantle them. And it's critical to understanding some of the policies that the federal government sponsored and reverse those. I'm not going to get into the details of all of them, but I've written, I'm a contributing editor to Politico magazine, and I've recently written some pieces where I go into this history in some detail. But the segregation that we live with, the separate and unequal neighborhoods that we live with in the United States, creates a dishonest budgetary politics in which society has overinvested in affluent white space and disinvested elsewhere. And then the people who are trapped in concentrated poverty are blamed for not being superhuman enough to overcome those obstacles. So in addition to centering racial justice and talking about it and educating people about past public policies, intention is required in adopting policies that dismantle. But meanwhile, again, we have a political landscape that makes that difficult. Social scientists find that racial resentment drives whites who harbor resentment to repudiate government interventions. Why? Because they attribute racial inequality to personal behavior and not systemic discrimination. And this, again, is a produced result of 5 decades of dog whistling. People have been taught to think of civil rights advances in zero-sum terms. So affordable health care, Medicaid expansion is a handout for other people under this divisive rhetoric. Even as life expectancy for whites pre-COVID was shrinking due to deaths of despair. There's a popular book called Dying of Whiteness, which shows how this divisive politics has lured people to vote against their interests and be less well off and die. Okay, well, a more viable strategy for progressives than trying to win over Trump supporters right away. I'm not saying we should give up on them, but a more viable strategy, excuse me, in the moment we're in, would be to continue to win elections powered by energized majorities of people of color and the whites who will ally with them. And you know, it goes without saying that not all white people think alike, and there's a growing swath of whites in this country, I call them culturally dexterous whites who accept robust diversity, even love it, even marry it, you know, and want to be part of what political scientists call the ascendant coalition of whites and people of color who want to pursue saner, evidence-based strategies, science-based strategies that address climate change, that competently address pandemics, that forthrightly address racial injustice. The good news in America is that despite extreme partisan division, a decisive majority of Americans since George Floyd's slow execution acknowledge anti-Black racism. So despite Trump's norm-shattering refusal to concede the race, we have a new administration that won and has majority governing power. And with a new lens for seeing racism and a commitment to redressing it, we have the possibility of beginning a third Reconstruction. Now, what would that look like? In particular, we must have clarity about the enduring structures of supremacy or caste, as I've talked about, and concrete policies for abolishing them. In my forthcoming book, there are 3 main processes of anti-Black caste that I identify that are at the heart of American segregation. Boundary maintenance, housing policies that encourage segregation rather than discourage it, opportunity hoarding, overinvesting in affluent white space, disinvesting in communities of color, and then stereotype-driven surveillance, which has been in the news a lot in these terrible videos. The most extreme versions of surveillance ending in innocent people dying at the hands of police. Well, so what I call for, rather than getting into the granular policies, what's most important is to construct what scholars and abolitionists call an abolition democracy. And to use the word abolition is to acknowledge that we should seek enduring transformation, not modest ephemeral reform. Abolition requires the destruction of anti-Black institutions, anti-Black, anti-Brown, and the creation of new humane structures of opportunity. W.E.B. Du Bois coined the phrase abolition democracy in his groundbreaking work, Black Reconstruction in America. The activist philosopher Angela Davis has expanded on that idea in a 2005 book, Abolition Democracy. And she writes that abolition is not only about the negative process of tearing down, but is primarily about building up. She emphasizes that in order to fully abolish the oppressive conditions that produce institutions like slavery, like mass incarceration, you need new democratic institutions to replace them. As prison abolitionist and scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore put it, abolition democracy is a way of political organizing, of being in the world, of trying every little thing to change and free ourselves of the old order and establish a new social order in the places we live in. And for me, applying this understanding to the American system of residential caste, our abolition requires the opposite of what we've done. Greenlining Black neighborhoods rather than redlining them. Inclusion rather than boundary maintenance. Equitable public funding rather than opportunity hoarding for a few. Humanization and care rather than surveillance and stereotyping. Abolition also requires agape love. Author and activist Bell Hooks argues that without an ethic of love shaping the direction of our political vision and our radical aspirations, we're often seduced into continued allegiance to systems of domination. And to use the word love in a movement for racial justice is to demand a radical, new, empathetic seeing of folk who are persistently dehumanized. And there are immense payoffs for choosing love over hate. Bell Hooks argues that the individual who chooses to apply a lens of love to oneself and others immediately begins their own liberation from cultures of domination. As I said before, if you can free yourself from the ideologies and the hysterical stereotypes about other people, that frees you to focus on policies not born of ideology, but policies born of evidence-based science. And you might actually get to more effective policies that are cheaper, for example, than mass incarceration. Well, I believe that moral agape love animates President Biden's stance on these issues. He is a practicing Catholic who often carries the rosary beads that belong to his deceased son, Beau, with him. So in many ways, the hardest work has begun. We have an ascendant coalition with a bare governing majority that's willing and able to see and name systemic racism. And Joe Biden and his administration have begun to act. What a refreshing first week or two we've had. And a silver lining of the Capitol insurrection, I believe, is that the national security threat is real to people, and it gives Biden a stronger mandate to redress racism and racial inequity. And he's begun with executive orders and executive action. This week, he rescinded the Trump administration's harmful ban on diversity and sensitivity training for federal agencies. He abolished Trump's 1776 commission, which was an attempt to shape American education in a way that denied the role of white supremacy in our history. He had a number of executive actions that speak to these different groups, canceling the so-called Muslim travel ban, trying to move forward in helping young immigrants who were brought here as, undocumented immigrants, helping them move to a path towards citizenship, prioritizing racial equity. The opposite of white supremacy is racial equality. And Biden was very, very specific on the campaign, and he's had some very specific things done. Among them that jumps out at me is his executive order requiring an equity analysis. With Susan Rice, my friend, who I first met at Oxford University, we played basketball for the women's team at Oxford. I have my half blue sweater from playing basketball at Oxford, some of the most joyous times of my life. He put Ambassador Susan Rice in charge of the Domestic Policy Council, and had an executive order that directs the agencies to review and report on equity in their ranks, including a plan on how to remove barriers to opportunities. And this builds on the innovative work that local governments have been doing. I'm going to give you one concrete example before I wrap up. The city of Baltimore, which is a highly segregated city, but has been led mainly by Black mayors and has a majority of Blacks on its city council, did an equity analysis and found that they were spending 4 times as much in white neighborhoods as they were in Black ones for basic public services. Had they not done that analysis and connected the data, they would not have known that. And so this is the kind of thing that this executive order calls for. And so the message is, as I close, it's clear to me that the Joe Biden gets what pluralism is about, right? You had a candidate who competed for the votes of people of color, and he's delivering specific policies that speak to their aspirations. That is what pluralism is, and that is what democracy is. And we have to hold him accountable. Clearly, much more is needed. We're going to need new regulations and new laws to deal with structures of supremacy. And meanwhile, we still have a gridlock Congress. And in this very, in this very disturbing moment, when you see evidence and have threats of domestic terrorism, and you see across the world explicit organization, neo-Nazi organizations, white supremacist organizations, it is critical that the democracy itself be bolstered. And so, there are proposals and proposed bills on the Hill that Democrats are advancing to restore and expand voting rights. All of that has to be done. Well, in conclusion, in recent years and on January 6th, many Americans worried that our democracy was sliding dangerously toward authoritarianism. White supremacists and nationalists have had prominent social media profiles, a dedicated news outlets and dark corners of the internet to perpetuate lies and conspiracy theories. And Donald Trump was, as a president of the United States, was at the center of this echo chamber. And it's fortunate that he and others have been deplatformed, but like the coronavirus, new variants will emerge. So I want to close and leave you with this thought. In any society in which white supremacists and extremists are actively organizing, all individuals have an obligation to choose how to respond. Passivity in the face of such forces is also a choice and not a good one. It's a time for choosing, and it's a time for honest reckoning. And that's the only way we will heal. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheryll. That was a fantastic talk and has already generated some questions. And now I can see a whole lot more coming through. I was really interested in what you said about the concept of inclusion, but also about love and about people forming human relationships with one another. And of course, I mentioned your link as a law clerk with Thurgood Marshall, whose most famous opinion in this country is Brown and the Board of Education, which was the case that held that racial segregation was unconstitutional in American schools. Is that still a problem, and is that something that can be addressed other than by dezoning neighborhoods? Because it does seem to me a way of enabling people to see one another as people if they are educated together.
You're talking about school integration.
Well, schools or and universities, perhaps both. Yes, I mean, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we have such a segregated landscape, racially segregated landscape in the US. I see this in my students, students who often experience robust diversity for the first time when they enter a college campus. So colleges and universities play a very, very important role. It will take a long time to create true inclusion at the block level across this country. We may never be able to do that. So yet colleges have an obligation to fight the segregated pipeline, you know, and do overt extra things to be sure that people who come from disadvantaged spaces, you know, there's genius and talent everywhere, as you well know, right? Right. So colleges should not reify the unequal pipeline that comes before them, and they have an obligation to do things fairly, but you know, to find the talent wherever it is and bring diverse talent, you know, together on college campuses. We also have an obligation to make sure that the opportunities at places like Oxford and Georgetown, you know, are widely distributed, because a lot of taxpayers subsidize these institutions, right? So that's critically important. I think it's even more important, you know, thank you for mentioning my boss, Thurgood Marshall. I just loved him dearly, loved him dearly. But you know, unfortunately, American schools are for the last 3 decades have been resegregating rapidly. And the truth of the matter is that the average Black or brown child in public schools in this country attends a majority minority school where they're exposed to a lot of poverty. And the average experience for a white or Asian child is the opposite. You know, they tend a majority white school that's mainly middle class. It doesn't have a lot of poverty, right? And so we have to continue fighting that fight and rewarding places where ascendant coalitions want inclusive policies, want school integration, and giving them help and tools to do it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a very interesting sort of practical proposal you've made. I'm going to try and group some of the questions we have. My Sam Spencer, one of my Mansfield students, has asked whether you could comment on any other practical or policy or law-based actions you would wish Biden to introduce. What some practical things that you think he could do to address some of these issues?
Thank you for asking. My expertise is in housing, so I'm going to start with housing, right? We have a law on the books the Fair Housing Act of 1968, right? It has two main goals: anti-discrimination. Private actors are not allowed to discriminate against renters or buyers on the basis of race or other statuses. But it also has an unenforced goal of every government, state, local government that receives federal funds has an affirmative obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And that goal has been unenforced. Barack Obama's administration was the first administration, 50 years later, to actually promulgate a rule that says, okay, you actually have to go out and eliminate barriers and affirmatively create mixed income, mixed race, affordable housing that gives people opportunity to live near good neighborhoods and good schools, right? And the Trump administration rescinded that rule. So at minimum, and I know the the Biden administration is going to do more. They need to, and they committed to do this on the campaign, they just haven't done it yet. They need to reinstate that rule. And there are other things. We have a lot of exclusionary policies, particularly zoning. An emancipated, ungridlocked Congress could pass a law just banning exclusionary zoning, making it illegal for affluent neighborhoods to use the zoning code to keep out even apartments, So, there's some concrete things we could do on the housing front. Do you want me to keep going or let?
No, it's okay. I guess allied to that, there's another question from Jerry about how you think Biden will mend the relationships between low-income neighborhoods and the police. So I guess that's again, maybe allied to zoning as a question.
Right. So the Justice Department, prior to the Trump administration, used to investigate police departments that had a chronic history of these awful shootings and racial abuses, right? In the Obama administration and prior administrations, but particularly the Obama administrations, you had almost like 16 to a couple of dozen consent decrees, right? Where they would go, in fact, in some police departments, the police chief would invite the federal government to come in and do a complete audit of policing and police practices to take politics out of it. And, they would enter into these decrees and they'd identify the problematic practices and recommend what needed to be done to transform these chronically problematic and abusive policing. Well, the Trump administration just stopped doing that, right? So we could return to those kind of practices. But I'm not an expert, and I think true transformation, frankly, has to happen at the local level, right? I'm aware of a number of cities after George Floyd and this summer have been reassessing how much money they put into policing. I don't like the unfortunate phrase defund the police, but for example, in the city of Milwaukee, they did an analysis and found that the city of Milwaukee was spending almost half of its budget on policing, right? And citizens drew up a citizen budget and identified the main priorities they want. Black citizens did this in their neighborhoods. And most of them, surprise, they wanted more affordable housing, more resources for young people and recreation and schools, and they got, through their own mobilization and politics, some reallocation from the police budget to these things, right? And so, but the Biden administration can do a lot. They can also help with funding,
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I'm going to move on to a bunch of questions. This is a slightly undemocratic way of doing things because they kind of come in, and in order to get them all in, I don't ask people to ask them themselves. So I hope people whose questions I'm trying to bunch up and paraphrase, you will forgive me. But there are a series of, I think, important questions about culture in America, and in particular, different ways, not racial ways, but different ways that people feel left behind. So Ross has asked a couple of questions. For example, what were the legitimate concerns of the 74 million people that voted for Trump? And also pointing out, for example, that the vast majority of Trump voters don't have a college degree. The people who are legislators do have a college degree. Someone else has asked a question about Biden opting to emphasize racial equality over other forms of political equality in his rhetoric. And does that risk furthering politics division? And then someone else has talked about the odd, obviously something that Trump has been good at somehow in talking to his supporters and making them feel special and represented. And that is seen, this is Lee says, I think emotion is what made people stick with Trump, often ignoring things like policy, which have affected them personally in a less than positive way. And talking openly and consistently about the racial equality, Lee says, well, normalize it, that'll help. But may it also stoke more fear of sense of rejection in people's hearts? And he summarizes this, I think this is a good summary of this bunch of questions. What do you think would be Biden and Harris's best strategy in starting to connect emotionally to people who feel other forms of disadvantage or unfairness, or are afraid or resistant to racial justice?
Well, I think Biden, and I think he does this. There's a reason he got 81 million votes, right? So 44% or something like that of whites voted for him. So he, but he should speak to people's economic pain, right? I think a lot of people, I'll never forget reading an interview with a white man who voted for Obama and Trump. Okay, something like 1/5 of people who voted for Trump also voted for Obama, right? So it's not just that you can't just say they're racist, right? But what this guy said is, Trump makes me feel good about myself. And I think he makes me feel seen. He gets me in my pain, right? So, but I think the best thing that Biden can do, not avoid discussing racial inequality, but that's not all he's addressing. He identified 6 main crises that this country faces, right? And inequality is one of them. So he can govern and speak to people, to economic fairness, and he can begin to deliver. And I think in a couple of years, as we build out of this pandemic and have higher wages and have people who are getting jobs in a new infrastructure building program, or getting jobs in clean energy, and beginning to feel like their lives are better, he's going to win some of those folks over, right? But I think, in order to win, you have to get to 51%, right? And Biden did that through a coalition, and we need to be honest. The subtext of Trump's message was a white identity politics, which we've lived with this in this country in a long time, and we shouldn't dance around that. And Biden refreshingly said this week, he said, we need to get past this idea that if we pursue racial equity, that means you're going to be left behind. That's not the point, right? So
because to win an election, you need 51%, but to change hearts and minds, you need a broader coalition. Someone's asked me why you think so many Hispanic people were involved in the attack on the Capitol.
Weren't that many?
No.
So many. I defy you to say it was a lot of them, right? But it was mainly white people. There, yes, okay, there were a couple, but just as with the election, right? But Trump made some inroads, some modest increases with Black and Latino voters, right? But it wasn't enough to win, and it was actually fairly modest compared to the, over the summer, 15 to 26 million people of all colors mobilized in 2,500 cities saying Black Lives Matter, right? I think there's a lot more long-term value in pursuing a mixed race coalition like that than pandering to a white identity politics. We got to move past that.
Okay, and then the other question which former Mansfield student Dan Hall, hi Dan, has put, he's thanked you for your clear and insightful talk. But he's made the point, really, you need more than 51%. So Democrats regularly win the popular vote in national elections, but the Electoral College and the Senate and issues of gerrymandering mean that often minority white-dominated Republican Party can hold on to power. And he asks, how big a barrier do you think that is, those institutional factors are to racial healing in the states? And do you think they can be overcome?
Well, whoever said that, you get an A+.
He did. He did.
That was in my talk. I was editing as I went because I had too much material, but everything he just identified, I had that list, right? And some of those things, particularly the Electoral College, are born of a desire to bolster the slave-owning states, right? There are structures of supremacy too. But we're going to see whether Democrats decide to get rid of the filibuster, because it is regular in this country right now. You to pick a public policy issue, whatever the majority consensus in polls, it does not get done in Congress. Whether it's, common sense gun control, climate change, even well, I'll just leave it at that, right? So those structures that he identified need to be reckoned with. And I think Democrats are getting religion on this, right? That there's talk of trying to make Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. a state, right? In order to guarantee more representation and power. So yeah, that definitely needs to be part of the agenda. And there are organizations that are working overtime on that. My dream is the day will come, and it will take a long time, that we will amend the Constitution to get rid of an electoral college. We cannot have a real democracy if popular will is overcome regularly.
Okay. And what about, takes a lawyer to ask this one, but what about the Supreme Court? How far is the new Supreme Court going to be a block on all the policy ideas and other things that you've talked about happening?
Well, it's clear that we have a definitive conservative majority now, but Chief Justice Roberts is interesting. He's now the swing vote, right? And when it comes to just pure politics, public policy, raising the minimum wage, the Supreme Court has nothing to say about that. More progressive taxation, there's nothing illegal or unconstitutional about that, right? Now, some of these more hot button issues, sure, they're going to be things that the Supreme Court could stand in the way. That happened with the Affordable Care Act, right? But John Roberts saved it, right? So, but if I'll say this, if this court is overtly obstructionist in the way the Supreme Court of the United States was overtly obstructionist to the first Reconstruction. They rendered the 14th Amendment it didn't give Black people any protection until Brown v. Board. Really, not much. Okay, so if they are that obstructionist, the day may come when a majority of Democrats pursues a different personnel strategy for the court. I'm not advocating that, but the court has to think about that. So we will see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know FDR tried to increase the size of the court, or it may be that you might introduce.
He threatened to.
Yeah, you know, he failed, but there we are. Anyway, well, it's very interesting times. It's great. At least when we first spoke about this talk, we didn't know if we could be talking about in the Biden era part of US racial healing, but here we are. So thank you very much, Sheryll, for that very stimulating talk. Thank you all for your questions. Next week, we have a talk which is jointly held in conjunction with the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. We have Dick Gang Moseneke, who was the Vice President of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, the post-apartheid court put in place, of course, by Nelson Mandela. He will be speaking with Cato Regan, who was also a justice of that court, is the director of the Bonavero Institute and a fellow of Mansfield College. She will be the discussant. So I hope people will join us then. If you have friends or colleagues who you know wanted to make this talk but couldn't make this time, it will be up on our YouTube channel in the next few days, as are all our Mansfield talks. And if you're interested in making sure you don't miss another one, please sign up. And we will send you details of the talks as they come through each term. But in the meantime, Sheryll, thank you very much indeed. And I hope that the next time I see you, it'll be in real life. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.